Thanks for joining us. I'm James Faulk. This is North Coast Perspectives. Humboldt County's steady increase in COVID numbers continued apace this week. According to county officials, 28 cases were added over the past 7 days, 100 over the month of July. It's enough to send the region's color-coded alert system into the orange or high-risk category. This level is associated with a lot of new cases, ripe conditions for community spread, and a high likelihood of undetected infections surreptitiously threading through local populations. So far, Humboldt County has had, having an issue with my prompter, okay. Here we go. So far, Humboldt County has had a total of 233 cases, 17 hospitalizations, and 4 deaths. Of those 233, 184 people have recovered. These figures tell a complicated story. Despite the elevated anxiety we're all feeling over the health of our families and ourselves, we're faring quite a bit better than most other parts of the state. The San Francisco Bay Area, Southern California, Sacramento, and even the Central Valley have case numbers that dwarf ours. This fact alone explains why county health officials have been so vehemently hammering the point that travel right now is a dangerous preoccupation. Just one trip into these more heavily impacted areas can exponentially increase the risk you face. This is not working very well, but we're going to persevere because that's what we do here at KEET. Your visit is never limited to the people you see around you when you go out of town. Each of those folks has a lengthy roster of contacts and acquaintances, friends and coworkers. So each time you leave Humboldt County and visit another household, you expose yourself and ultimately this community to a legion of rabid germs seeking to feast on all your friends and neighbors. According to the county's own COVID dashboard, travel accounts for roughly 28% of our local infections. Another 52.4% comes from contact with a known COVID patient, one who may have gotten sick from vacationing themselves. So every time you hop in the car and drive a few hours north, south, east, or west, happy to leave home and get reacquainted with Grandma Betty or Uncle Steve, remember that you literally are taking your life in your hands, yours and everyone else's. Now the interview. Eureka poet laureate David Holper is behind a recent project to collect and publicize verse from area residents, poems that deal with COVID-19 and the quarantine. Holper, a longtime local poet himself, has agreed to come onto the show and discuss this project. He'll also be reading a poem of his own from the new collection, Behind the Mask, 40 Quarantine Poems from Humboldt County. So, David, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me, James.
I was a little tongue-tied there. Hopefully that didn't make you nervous, but
no, I'm fine.
People around me are all squeamish about it. It's fine. But first, let's talk about your project. How did Behind the Mask get started?
Well, it was kind of one of those things, you know, when the pandemic hit, I had a project that I had planned for April. I was going to do a big reading at the Morris Graves, and that had to be canceled. And then several people in the community that I knew said, you should do something online so people can share their poems that they're writing now. So I started a Facebook group called Poetry on the Edge. And a friend of mine who's a poet, Annie Fricky, was writing a whole quarantine series. I think she had gotten up to like 15 or 20 poems. And it kind of inspired me, and I started writing them. And we wound up talking with one another about how many poems there were about the pandemic. And she said, hey, you want to put a chapbook together? And I said, yeah, that's a great idea. It'll give people an outlet for all this poetry that's being written. So that's how it got started, is off that Poetry on the Edge Facebook group.
Yeah. Now, what kind of poems were you looking for? Were you trying to focus on the illness itself or on the quarantine, people's boredom? I mean, how did you try to organize that?
Yeah, we just said that anything about the pandemic, you know, whatever it was, if it was growing a garden or if it was your anxieties or, you know, more artistic response, whatever, we were open to any of it. And we expected, I think, maybe 20 poems or so, and we got probably double that. So there were only a couple that people sent in that weren't really pandemic poems, and we didn't decline them outright and just didn't say, okay, we won't take this, sorry, we're not interested. We said to them, listen, this doesn't fit the theme of what we're trying to do, so we'll give you an extra week if you want to write a poem that fits with this, or if you have something that fits the theme. And at least one person did that. They sent us in a different poem that did fit the theme, so we wound up with an even 40 poems.
Well, what did you think about the quality of the poems that you received? I mean, obviously you've been in the poetry scene locally for a long time. Did it surprise you?
Yeah, there were some really good poems in there. Overall, I think the collection's pretty strong. And I'm really glad we did it because it gave people an outlet to express themselves in, obviously something that's really troubling to all of us. Fears of death, fears of illness, fears of, somebody that you love getting sick. So I think the collection's really quite good. So anyway, I'm very pleased with it, and I think Annie is too.
Yeah, that's great. You're going to read for us today. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It's a Swedish title, I think. It's a Board for N. Is that what
Yeah,
it is?
yeah. And so I saw this online, I think on Facebook one morning, that this couple in Sweden had some guests over, but they couldn't have them in the house, so they put a table out in a field, and they put a cable to the table so that they could send the food in a basket. And I guess they liked the idea, so they opened this restaurant called Board for N, which is table for one. And it's a Swedish restaurant that was recently opened during the pandemic. The restaurant is a single table in a field, and the food is sent via cable in a basket. Only one person per day is served.
Wow.
So here it is, Board for N.
Excellent.
Please sit. This is your table. It stands rooted to the earth, like the Galapagos, where for centuries the flightless cormorant harbored, without fear of predation. We too have one special today, safety. It comes with the side of sky, over the russet bed of a fallow field, where we promise you will be left utterly alone. We will send over your meal via cable in a wicker basket. We place a checkered cloth over it, like the print from Dorothy's dress, in which she was swept far away from any world she knew. What else is available? Sorry, we're out of assurances. Yet even in the whirlwind, it is still the safest restaurant in the world. If when your food arrives, a sparrow alights, we would appreciate it if you offer her a little bread, a bit of water from your glass. She has come so far to be with you, and it takes so little to show you have not forgotten your humanity at home.
In times of crisis like this one, literature and poetry more specifically tends to thrive. I mean, you think of World War I, for example, and now obviously the COVID crisis. Why do you think that is? Why do you think people get such a therapeutic, feeling from the arts?
I think poetry really speaks to our emotional core. I know when Billy Collins was the poet laureate for the United States, he used to say, he was quoting somebody, and I'm not sure where the quote came from, but that poetry was the emotional history of the human race. And I think that's a good way of putting it, because poems oftentimes get to that emotional core of the things that we're afraid of, or the things that we care deeply about. And I think it's a great vehicle for that. It allows us to say things in ways that we can't say in ordinary life. And I've seen this again and again at the poetry slams and poetry, performances here in Humboldt County. It gives people an avenue to speak, the truth of their hearts to one another. And it's really a powerful thing when you do that and when you do it well. So,
yeah. What do you think? I mean, this is obviously subjective, but what do you think makes a good poem?
Well, I think it is subjective, but there's certain kind of commonalities. In fact, I teach an essay around this. So, I think it usually has some lyricism, some specific detail. It does have some emotional power to it, just in the way that it's constructed. Oftentimes it uses simile or metaphor to make leaps into things that otherwise we wouldn't connect to. And one thing I tell my students is that a good poem oftentimes takes what is rather ordinary that we wouldn't even notice, and it re-energizes it. It helps us to re-see that thing that we haven't even noticed right in front of us, and shows us how miraculous it is or how wonderful it is. So it kind of changes the way we look at things, and I think that's what a really good poem will do.
Makes the everyday transcendent, in a sense.
It does, yeah.
So if someone wants to get a hold of this collection of poems, what can they do? Where can they find it?
Yeah, so anybody can go get the PDF of them. It's pretty easy. You can go onto the Ink People's website, and under there's a thing for I think artists and local poets, and there's a Poet Laureate website, and there's a link for that PDF, so you can find it there. You can also find it under my website, davidholper.com. That's all one word, davidholper.com. And then Annie Fricke has a website, and it's available through her website as well, and it's anniefricke.com. So pretty easy to find. Annie also went and got print copies of it available, and I heard somebody dropped off some print copies at Northtown Books. So if you want a print copy, you can go get one from them, or you can contact one of us and we'll make sure you get a print copy as well.
Excellent, David. Thanks for joining us. That was a great conversation. That's all the time we have. In the coming weeks, we'll be inviting poets from the project to read their COVID poems on our show and help spread the word. Have a great weekend.
All right, thank you.
It's been an ongoing struggle these past several years in Humboldt County to provide drug and alcohol treatment to anyone who wants to get better. We've had treatment, both outpatient and in, yet without health insurance or court order, getting admitted to these facilities has often proved impossible. Tonight we feature the next chapter in our ongoing series on waterfront recovery, which has finally made fully accessible treatment a fact here on the North Coast.
From the very start, when they talked about COVID, we right away had an emergency protocol on how to deal with it, starting with our staff. You know, we talked about all the CDC requirements, distance and hygiene, and we stopped having people come in. Unfortunately, children visitation with their parents here on CWS had to stop. Our meetings for our alumni had to stop. Family recovery services had to stop because we couldn't get them in. However, we did not stop admitting people, but they go through a long and comprehensive evaluation to assure us that they've not been exposed, and so on, the CDC recommendations. And then when they come in, we quarantined them for 14 days.
Getting PPE was a bit of a challenge, and it still is. We were lucky enough to receive a grant from the State Fund Essential Business Fund. So that allowed us to purchase bulk PPE, so face shields, masks, gowns, thermometers, things like that. So we'll have that into the future. However, it's a challenge for everybody to get it.
We have televisions, so we see them everywhere. And our staff will go there to say, hey, you're too close to each other, or hey, you need to wear your masks, And we let the residents know, first offense, you're warned, second offense, you're written, and if you're written up 3 times, that's a reason for discharge. And we don't allow them to watch the regular television, especially the local ones. So I had to let them know what's going on and why we need to do what we were doing then to make sure that we maintain the fact that there has not been any infection here. We can't take the risk for our patients. We can't take the risk for our employees. They're essential workers. And if we close down, that's going to be adding to the number of unemployed.
An incidental encounter at Humboldt State University Wednesday led to the arrest of 2 out-of-state fugitives on suspicion of murder. At around 1 o'clock early Wednesday morning, 2 campus police officers were patrolling the University Corporation Yard, a satellite property off Samoa Boulevard owned by HSU. The officers discovered an unoccupied vehicle with stolen plates parked on the east side of the building. They approached on foot to find 3 people sleeping near the vehicle in a stairwell. After all 3 were identified, 2 were found to be wanted for alleged homicide out of Virginia. Daniel Fish and Ashley Nicole McAllister were arrested without incident, while their unwitting traveling companion was released. UPD says this is an active investigation and the department is in direct contact with Virginia's Henry County Sheriff's Office. New technology will soon allow Humboldt County to more than triple the number of COVID tests it can complete in a day. Paid for with state and federal grant funding, the Kingfisher Flex by Thermo Fisher Scientific automates the extraction of RNA, genetic material that allows a microbiologist to determine if a patient's sample contains markers for the COVID-19 virus. This automation will allow about 94 samples to be prepared in less than 30 minutes. The old system, performed by hand, could only handle 10 per hour.
Our laboratory began testing for COVID around February of earlier this year. We started off with the CDC assay, and we started off with about 20 to 30 samples a day, and over the last couple of months have ramped up to about 85 samples a day. To put it in perspective, last year and every year prior to that, we did about 150 to 200 PCR tests for the whole year. And over the last 4 months, we've done 6,000 COVID PCR tests, which is a huge dramatic increase. And so we continue to ramp up our testing capacity due to the demand here locally. And with that is adding additional equipment and new testing options for us. So recently, we were able to get a new testing option for COVID, which is the TACPath Kingfisher option. We obtained a Kingfisher extraction equipment, which will dramatically increase our capacity for testing, about threefold, in fact. So what that does, currently we have other extractors, but they're pretty small, and they do about 8 samples per hour, and another one does about 14 samples per hour. So over an hour period, we can only extract 22 samples that are prepped up for our PCR step. With this new piece of equipment, we're able to do 96 samples in about 23 minutes. And so it should triple our capacity in about 2 weeks. So we're really excited about this opportunity. We're one of the only laboratories that are here testing COVID locally, and we need to ensure fast turnaround times. So we have a testing prioritization chart that prioritizes different populations. So we want to focus on the symptomatic individuals as well as protecting our healthcare workforce. And so we also focus on congregate living facilities. And so we do some asymptomatic screening in those populations because they're really important to protect them. Turnaround time for testing is vital for us to conduct a adequate communicable disease investigation so that we can prevent and control outbreaks and further spread of COVID-19. That's why our laboratory has been investing in equipment and supplies for us to increase our capacity to respond to those specific instances and cut down on turnaround time.
We'll be back in a flash after this short break.
On July 19 and 20, 1848, between 200 and 300 people attended the first Women's Rights Convention organized by Stanton and Mott. On the first day of the convention, a Declaration of Sentiments was read. On day 2, men were invited and over 40 attended, including Frederick Douglass. The 12 resolutions in the Declaration of Sentiments were passed, including the 9th resolution proclaiming a woman's right to vote. A portion of the Declaration of Sentiments is as follows.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights.
I want to say a few words about this matter. I am a woman's rights. I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man.
Thanks for joining us. I'm James Faulk. This week, North Coast Congressman Jared Huffman grilled Acting National Parks Police Chief Greg Monahan on the handling of protesters at Lafayette Park in Washington, D.C. on June 1st.
At the top of page 8, that agreement requires the Park Police to update its procedure to provide audible warnings to protesters to disperse. And there are 4 significant parts of that legally enforceable commitment that your agency made. The first is officers must be positioned in the rear of the crowd so that they can actually hear the warnings that are given before the police advance. The second is that they need to use sound amplification as needed And third, that they need to warn the protesters that they are in violation of a specific law. There's a substantive requirement as part of that warning. And fourth, maybe most significantly for June 1st, the arresting officers positioned in the rear of the crowd are required to give a verbal and/or physical indication to the officers in the front who were giving that warning so that your officers can confirm that it was audible and that it had been heard by the protesters. Were all of these procedures followed on June 1st? All right, I just want to get your direct answer, and you say that every one of those procedures was followed. I'm going to ask to play a video that we believe suggests otherwise, Mr. Chief, and so I'd like to ask staff to play the clip entitled Warning 1.
A voice on a loudspeaker briefly cuts through the noise. The announcement appears to come from the southeast part of the park. Even on the front lines of the protest, in footage reviewed by the Post, the words are drowned out. Protesters turn to one another in confusion.
Members of the House Natural Resources Committee also heard from National Guard whistleblower Adam DeMarco, who decried the government's action. Last week, Huffman announced his support of the Preventing Authoritarian Policing Tactics on America's Streets Act. The bill would block the Trump administration from deploying federal forces as a shadowy paramilitary against Americans. Humboldt County Health Officer Teresa Frankovich this week put some numbers behind the county's contention that traveling outside the area presents a big risk for increased COVID infections. Every major region of the state has infection numbers that vastly exceed our own and therefore should be avoided, she said.
I know I've been repeating often about our concerns about gatherings and travel as being a source of a lot of our infections lately, and in particular, the combination of the two. So it's our residents going away and meeting up with friends and family in other areas. And it's our local residents inviting family and friends here to visit and gathering. I've mentioned repeatedly that travel introduces risk. And what I wanted to do is just kind of give people an idea about how much risk that represents. So if we look, when we look at some of the data from areas across the state, what we see is that if you're thinking about traveling to the Bay Area, for example, San Francisco, Alameda, Santa Clara, Marin, San Mateo, those counties, they are reporting COVID-19 rates that are about 4 to 9 times what we're seeing here in Humboldt. If we look at Sacramento County, their rates are about 6 times what we're seeing here locally. Los Angeles, San Bernardino, Riverside in Southern California, those are COVID-19 rates about 9 to 14 times Humboldt County. And when we look at the Central Valley, which is struggling right now with a lot of COVID disease, Kern, Merced, Kings County, and I believe Stanislaus County as well is reporting high rates. They're reporting rates 11 to 20 times what we're seeing here in Humboldt. And so it's just a really important consideration for people. I realize it sometimes feels like I'm just going to visit my mom and dad or my sister down in, Kearns County. The problem is that the likelihood of you encountering someone who's ill in that visit is much higher than it is locally if you're out and about in the community. And the likelihood that a family member or friend that you're visiting has been exposed and may become ill in the next, couple days is much higher. And by the same token, when you bring people in from those areas, you introduce the possibility of more virus in our community. So this is a time where people really across our state, across our country should be staying closer to home and not increasing transmission from where they are.
This Sunday at 10:30 p.m., KEET will be airing the second PBS American Portrait special, The Family of Us. In Part 2, we see a moving and meaningful picture of families in America today and the way these relationships shape us. Families of all shapes and sizes give us a look into their lives, revealing how we value our families now more than ever. Please tune in Sunday night at 10:30 on KEET HD. We'll be right back.
This is my family. I'm gonna give you just a little snippet of my family. Hello. my grandpa and I have this unspoken bond.
I decided to document seeing my dad.
We became a family.
I have a biological family, but the family you choose love you unconditionally.
On American Experience.
They were running the biggest deficits in history, pouring stimulus into the economy.
What I'm describing now is a plan and a hope for the long term. The march of freedom and democracy, which will leave Marxism, Leninism on the ash heap of history.
I thought he could possibly press the button.
The conclusion of Reagan on American Experience.
Thanks for joining us. I'm James Faulk. Eureka Mayor Susan Seaman, in her taped weekly statement today, expressed pride in how her city has been able to unite in the face of COVID-19. She pointed to a recent effort to make sure that area businesses had all the personal protective equipment they needed to persevere.
I'd also like to take a moment today to recognize how we as a community really know how to work together to make things happen. When the Governor's Office of Emergency Services sent personal protection equipment to distribute to local businesses, the community came together as one. City staff from several jurisdictions, including the City of Eureka, Chamber of Commerce representatives, economic development leaders, business owners, Red Cross volunteers, and community members all came together for a week of hard work to make sure hundreds of local businesses are able to access free face masks and hand sanitizer. It demonstrated the generosity of our community with a true volunteer spirit. It also showed that we have the determination and strength to unite to get things done. These are some of the same characteristics that are fundamental to creating a truly resilient Eureka. And in appreciation of our neighbors, we want to keep them safe. We have the power to do that. We can slow the virus and protect each other by practicing some simple habits. Washing our hands for 20 seconds, staying at home if we don't feel well, and wearing a face mask indoors and outdoors if you can't maintain a 6-foot distance from other people. Just carry it in your hand with you. Sometimes we may have to make bigger sacrifices, like limiting travel or missing out on social gatherings. For those who are making those sacrifices, thank you.
That's all the time we have for tonight. After weeks and weeks of quoting officials and presenting the facts and figures behind COVID-19, it's clear to me that most everyone knows precisely how to keep themselves and their communities safe. Keep your distance, wear a mask, wash your hands. We'll add a new item to the list this week, given all the recent attention paid to traveling outside our area. If you can't stay home, do so. Stay tuned, stay informed.